What made you afraid when you were a child? Oh, I'm not talking about life's real horrors. I'm talking about those innocuous, absurd things that scared us as children. Things that we laugh at now as we openly mock our younger selves over how little it took to unnerve us. The black and white photos of long dead relatives staring at us from our grandparents' bedrooms. The paintings of clowns or perhaps large, sinister animals our parents plastered on our bedroom walls to comfort us at night. The loud, sharp staccato of fireworks or bursting balloons. These days, we commiserate over these childhood fears on social media with a shared sense of community and comfort that others were scared by the exact same absurdities. Large Marge in Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Judge Doom in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the way the real-life stuffed Winnie the Pooh toy winks at the camera at the end of the 1977 Disney movie. Well, maybe that one was just me. A shared childhood trauma that does come up often is Roald Dahl's The Witches, particularly the movie and its grotesque special effects. Roald Dahl's children's books, and not surprisingly their film counterparts, so often tap into childhood fears of monsters, giants, insects, and bullies, and thus have a special ability to unnerve, which shouldn't come as a surprise to those who know how truly sinister Dahl's adult writings could get. Listen now to 3 of these short stories, and remember to keep the night light on next to your bed. An excerpt from The Witches, 1983. Now that the manager had gone, I was not particularly alarmed. What better than to be imprisoned in a room full of these splendid ladies? If I ever got talking to them, I might even suggest that they come and do a bit of cruelty to children preventing at my school. We could certainly use them there. In they came, talking their heads off. They began milling round and choosing their seats, and there was a whole lot of stuff like, "Come and sit next to me, Millie dear," and "Oh, hello, Beatrice. I haven't seen you since the last meeting. What an adorable dress you have on." I decided to stay where I was and let them get on with their meeting while I got on with my mouse training. But I watched them for a while longer through the crack in the screen, waiting for them to settle down. How many were there? I guessed about 200. The back rows filled up first. They all seemed to want to sit as far back from the platform as possible. There was a lady wearing a tiny green hat in the middle of the back row who kept scratching the nape of her neck. She couldn't leave it alone. It fascinated me the way her fingers kept scratching away at the hair on the back of her neck. Had she known somebody was watching her from behind, I'm sure she would have been embarrassed. I wonder if she had dandruff. All of a sudden, I noticed that the lady next to her was doing the same thing. And the next one. And the next. The whole lot of them were doing it. They were all scratching away like mad at the hair on the back of their necks. Did they have fleas in their hair? Most likely it was nits. A boy at school called Ashton had nits in his hair last term, and the matron had made him dip his whole head in turpentine. It killed the nits all right, but it nearly killed Ashton as well. Half the skin came away from his scalp. I began to be fascinated by these hair-scratching ladies. It is always funny when you catch someone doing something coarse and she thinks no one is looking. Nose-picking, for example, or scratching her bottom. Hair-scratching is very nearly as unattractive, especially if it goes on and on. I decided it had to be nits. Then, the most astonishing thing happened. I saw one lady pushing her fingers up underneath the hair on her head, and the hair, the entire head of hair, lifted upwards all in one piece, and the hand slid underneath the hair and went on scratching. She was wearing a wig. She was also wearing gloves. I glanced swiftly around at the rest of the now seated audience. Every one of them was wearing gloves. My blood turned to ice. I began to shake all over. I glanced frantically behind me for a back door to escape through. There wasn't one. Should I leap out from behind the screen and make a dash for the double doors? Those double doors were already closed, and I could see a woman standing in front of them. She was bending forward and fixing some sort of a metal chain round the two door handles. "Keep still," I told myself. "No one has seen you yet. There's no reason in the world why they should come and look behind the screen." But one false move, one cough, one sneeze, one nose blow, one little sound of any sort, and it won't be just one witch that gets you. It'll be 200. At that point, I think I fainted. The whole thing was altogether too much for a small boy to cope with. But I don't believe I was out for more than a few seconds, and when I came to, I was lying on the carpet and I was still, thank heavens, behind the screen. There was absolute silence all around me. Rather shakily, I got to my knees and peered once again through the crack in the screen. All the women, or rather the witches, were now sitting motionless in their chairs and staring as though hypnotized at someone who had suddenly appeared on the platform. That somebody was another woman. The first thing I noticed about this woman was her size. She was tiny, probably no more than 4.5 feet tall. She looked quite young, I guessed about 25 or 6, and she was very pretty. She had on a rather stylish long black dress that reached right to the ground, and she wore black gloves that came up to her elbows. Unlike the others, she wasn't wearing a hat. She didn't look to me like a witch at all, but she couldn't possibly not be one. Otherwise, what on earth was she doing up there on the platform? And why, for heaven's sake, were all the other witches gazing at her with such a mixture of adoration, awe, and fear? Very slowly, the young lady on the platform raised her hands to her face. I saw her gloved fingers unhooking something behind her ears, and then she caught hold of her cheeks and lifted her face clean away. The whole of that pretty face came away in her hands. It was a mask. As she took off the mask, she turned sideways and placed it carefully upon a small table nearby. And when she turned round again and faced us, I very nearly screamed out loud. That face of hers was the most frightful and frightening thing I had ever seen. Just looking at it gave me the shakes all over. It was so crumpled and wizened, so shrunken and shriveled, it looked as though it had been pickled in vinegar. It was a fearsome and ghastly sight. There was something terribly wrong with it, something foul and putrid and decayed. It seemed quite literally to be rotting away at the edges, and in the middle of the face, around the mouth and cheeks, I could see the skin all cankered and worm-eaten, as though maggots were working away in there. There are times when something is so frightful you become mesmerized by it and can't look away. I was like that now. I was transfixed. I was numbed. I was magnetized by the sheer horror of this woman's features. But there was more to it than that. There was a look of serpents in those eyes of hers as they flashed around the audience. I knew immediately, of course, that this was none other than the Grand High Witch herself. I knew also why she had worn a mask. She could never have moved around in public, let alone book in at a hotel with her real face. Everyone who saw her would have run away screaming.
"The doors!"
shouted the Grand High Witch in a voice that filled the room and bounced around the walls.
"Are they chained and bolted?"
"The doors are chained and bolted, your grandness,"
answered a voice in the audience. The brilliant snake's eyes that were set so deep in that dreadful, rotting, worm-eaten face glared unblinkingly at the witches who sat facing her.
"You may remove your gloves,"
she shouted. Her voice, I noticed, had that same hard metallic quality as the voice of the witch I had met under the conker tree, only it was far louder and much, much harsher. It rasped, it grated, it snarled, it scraped, it shrieked, and it growled. Everyone in the room was peeling off her gloves. I was watching the hands of those in the back row. I wanted very much to see what their fingers looked like and whether my grandmother had been right. Ah, yes, I could see several of them now. I could see the brown claws curving over the tips of the fingers. They were about 2 inches long, those claws, and sharp at the ends.
You may remove your shoes,
Barked the Grand High Witch. I heard a sigh of relief going up from all the witches in the room as they kicked off their narrow, high-heeled shoes. And then I got a glimpse under the chairs of several pairs of stockinged feet, square and completely toeless. Revolting they were, as though the toes had been sliced away from the feet with a carving knife.
You may remove your wigs,
Snarled the Grand High Witch. She had a peculiar way of speaking. There was some sort of a foreign accent there, something harsh and guttural, and she seemed to have trouble pronouncing the letter W. As well as that, she did something funny with the letter R. She would roll it round and round her mouth like a piece of hot pork crackling before spitting it out.
Remove your wigs and get some fresh air into your spotty scalps,
She shouted, and another sigh of relief arose from the audience as all the hands went up to the heads and all the wigs, with the hats still on them, were lifted away. There now appeared in front of me, row upon row of bald female heads, a sea of naked scalps, every one of them red and itchy-looking from being rubbed by the linings of the wigs. I simply cannot tell you how awful they were, and somehow the whole sight was made more grotesque, because underneath those frightful, scabby, bald heads, the bodies were dressed in fashionable and rather pretty clothes. It was monstrous. It was unnatural. Oh, heavens, I thought. Oh, help. Oh, Lord, have mercy on me. These foul, bald-headed females are child killers, every single one of them. And here I am imprisoned in the same room, and I can't escape. At that point, a new and doubly horrifying thought struck me. My grandmother had said that with their special nose holes, they could smell out a child on a pitch-black night from right across the other side of the road. Up to now, my grandmother had been right every time. It seemed a certainty, therefore, that one of the witches in the back row was going to sniff me out at any moment, and then the yell of
dogs' droppings
would go up all over the room, and I would be cornered like a rat. I knelt on the carpet behind the screen, hardly daring to breathe. Then suddenly, I remembered something very important my grandmother had told me. The dirtier you are, she had said, the harder it is for a witch to smell you out. How long since I had last had a bath? Not for ages. I had my own room in the hotel, and my grandmother never bothered with silly things like that. Come to think of it, I don't believe I'd had a bath since we'd arrived. When had I last washed my hands or face? Certainly not this morning. Not yesterday either. I glanced down at my hands. They were covered with smudge and mud and goodness knows what else besides. So perhaps I had a chance after all. The stink waves couldn't possibly get out through all that dirt.
Witches of England,
shouted the Grand High Witch. She herself, I noticed, had not taken off either her wig or her gloves or her shoes.
Witches of England,
she yelled. The audience stirred uneasily and sat up straighter in their chairs.
Miserable witches,
she yelled.
Useless, lazy witches, feeble, fribbling witches. You are a heap of idle, good-for-nothing worms.
A shudder went through the audience. The Grand High Witch was clearly in an ugly mood, and they knew it. I had a feeling that something awful was going to happen soon.
I am having my breakfast this morning,
cried the Grand High Witch.
And I am looking out of the window at the beach. And what am I seeing? I am asking you, what am I seeing? I am seeing a revolting sight. I am seeing hundreds, I am seeing thousands of rotten, repulsive little children playing on the sand. It is putting me right off my food. Why have you not got rid of them?
she screamed.
Why have you not rubbed them all out, these filthy, smelly children?
With each word she spoke, flecks of pale blue phlegm shot from her mouth like little bullets.
I am asking you, why?
She screamed. Nobody answered her question.
Children smell,
she screamed.
They stink out the world. We do not want these children around here.
The bald heads in the audience all nodded vigorously.
One child a week is no good to me,
the Grand High Witch cried out.
Is that the best you can do?
We will do better, murmured the audience. We will do much better.
Better is no good either,
shrieked the Grand High Witch.
I demand maximum results. So here are my orders. My orders are that every single child in this country shall be rubbed out, squashed, squirted, squirted, and frittered before I come here again in 1 year's time. Do I make myself clear?
A great gasp went up from the audience. I saw the witches all looking at one another with deeply troubled expressions, and I heard one witch at the end of the front row saying aloud, "All of them? We can't possibly wipe out all of them." The Grand High Witch whipped round as though someone had stuck a skewer into her bottom.
Who said that?
She snapped.
Who dares to argue with me? It was you, was it not?
She pointed a gloved finger as sharp as a needle at the witch who had spoken. "I didn't mean it, your grandness," the witch cried out. "I didn't mean to argue. I was just talking to myself."
"You dared to argue with me,"
screamed the Grand High Witch. "I was just talking to myself," cried the wretched witch. "I swear it, your grandness." She began to shake with fear. The Grand High Witch took a quick step forward, and when she spoke again, it was in a voice that made my blood run cold.
"A stupid witch who answers back must burn until her bones are black,"
she screamed. "No, no," begged the witch in the front row. The Grand High Witch went on.
"A foolish witch without a brain must sizzle in the fiery flame."
"Save me," cried the wretched witch in the front row. The Grand High Witch took no notice of her. She spoke again.
"An idiotic witch like you must roast upon the barbecue."
"Forgive me, O your grandness," cried the miserable culprit. "I didn't mean it." But the Grand High Witch continued with her terrible recital.
"A witch who dares to say I'm wrong will not be with us very long."
A moment later, a stream of sparks that looked like tiny white-hot metal filings came shooting out of the Grand High Witch's eyes and flew straight towards the one who had dared to speak. I saw the sparks striking against her and burrowing into her, and she screamed a horrible howling scream, and a puff of smoke rose up around her. A smell of burning meat filled the room. Nobody moved. Like me, they were all watching the smoke, and when it had cleared away, the chair was empty. I caught a glimpse of something wispy white, like a little cloud, fluttering upwards and disappearing out of the window. A great sigh rose up from the audience. The Grand High Witch glared around the room.
"I hope nobody else is going to make me cross today,"
she remarked. There was a deathly silence.
"Frizzled like a fritter,"
said the Grand High Witch.
"Cooked like a carrot. You will never see her again. Now we can get down to business." Children are revolting.
screamed the Grand High Witch.
We will wipe them all away. We will scrub them off the face of the earth. We will flush them down the drain.
Yes, yes, chanted the audience. Wipe them away, scrub them off the earth, flush them down the drain.
Children are foul and filthy.
Thundered the Grand High Witch. They are, chorused the English witches. They are foul and filthy,
Children are dirty and stinky.
screamed the Grand High Witch. Dirty and stinky, cried the audience, getting more and more worked up.
Children are smelling of dogs' droppings.
Screeched the Grand High Witch. Pooh, cried the audience. Pooh, pooh, pooh.
They are worse than dogs' droppings.
Screeched the Grand High Witch.
Dogs' droppings is smelling like violets and primroses compared with children.
Violets and primroses, chanted the audience. They were clapping and cheering almost every word spoken from the platform. The speaker seemed to have them completely under her spell.
To talk about children is making me sick.
Screamed the Grand High Witch.
I am feeling sick even thinking about them. Fetch me a basin.
The Grand High Witch paused and glared at the mass of eager faces in the audience. They waited, wanting more.
So now,
Barked the Grand High Witch.
so now I am having a plan. I am having a giganticus plan for getting rid of every single child in the whole of England.
The witches gasped. They gaped. They turned and gave each other ghoulish grins of excitement.
Yes,
Thundered the Grand High Witch.
we shall squish them and swallow them, and we shall make them to disappear, every single smelly little brat in England, in one stroke.
Whoopee! Cried the witches, clapping their hands. You are brilliant, oh your grandness. You are fantabulous,
Shut up and listen.
snapped the Grand High Witch.
Listen very carefully, and let us not be having any muck-ups.
The audience leaned forward, eager to learn how this magic was going to be performed.
Each and every one of you
Thundered the Grand High Witch.
is to go back to your hometowns immediately and resign from your jobs. Resign, give notice, retire.
We will, they cried. We will resign from our jobs.
And after you have resigned from your jobs,
The Grand High Witch went on.
each and every one of you will be going out and you will be buying.
She paused. What will we be buying? They cried. Tell us, O brilliant one, what is it we shall be buying?
Sweet shops.
Shouted the Grand High Witch. Sweet shops, they cried. We are going to buy sweet shops. What a frumptuous wheeze!
Each of you will be buying for herself a sweet shop. You will be buying the very best and most respectable sweet shops in England.
We will, they answered. Their dreadful voices were like a chorus of dentist drills all grinding away together.
I am wanting no tuppenny, halfpenny, crummy little tobacco-selling, newspaper sweet shops.
Shouted the Grand High Witch.
I am wanting you to get only the very best shops, filled up with piles and piles of luscious sweets and tasty chalks.
The best, they cried. We shall buy the best sweet shops in town.
You will be having no trouble in getting what you want,
Shouted the Grand High Witch.
because you will be offering 4 times as much as a shop is worth, and nobody is refusing an offer like that. Money is not a problem to us witches, as you know very well. I have brought with me 6 trunks stuffed full of English banknotes, all new and crisp, and all of them,
She added with a fiendish leer.
all of them homemade.
The witches in the audience grinned, appreciating this joke. At that point, one foolish witch got so excited at the possibilities presented by owning a sweet shop that she leapt to her feet and shouted, "The children will come flocking to my shop, and I will feed them poisoned sweets and poisoned chalks, and wipe them all out like weasels." The room became suddenly silent. I saw the tiny body of the Grand High Witch stiffen and then go rigid with rage.
"Who spoke?" she shrieked. "It was you over there."
The culprit sat down fast and covered her face with her clawed hands.
"You blithering pumpkin!"
screeched the Grand High Witch.
"You brainless bog vamper! Are you not realizing that if you are going round poisoning little children, you will be caught in 5 minutes flat? Never in my life am I hearing such a bush-walloping suggestion coming from a witch."
The entire audience cowered and shook. I'm quite sure they all thought, as I did, that the terrible white-hot sparks were about to start flying again. Curiously enough, they didn't.
"If such a tom-fiddling idea is all you can be coming up with,"
thundered the Grand High Witch,
"then it is no wonder England is still swarming with rotten little children."
There was another silence. The Grand High Witch glared at the witches in the audience.
"Do you not know,"
she shouted at them,
"that we witches are working only with magic?"
"We know, your grandness," they all answered. "Of course we know." The Grand High Witch grated her bony gloved hands against each other and cried out,
"So each of you is owning a magnificent sweet shop. The next move is that each of you will be announcing in the window of your shop that on a certain day you will be having a great gala opening with free sweets and chalks to every child."
"That will bring them in, the greedy little brutes," cried the audience. "They'll be fighting to get through the doors."
"Next,"
continued the Grand High Witch,
"you will prepare yourselves for this great gala opening by filling every chalk and every sweet in your shop with my very latest and greatest magic formula. This is known as Formula 86 Delayed Action Mouse Maker."
"Delayed action mouse maker," they chanted. "She's done it again. Her grandness has concocted yet another of her wondrous magic child killers. How do we make it, O brilliant one?"
"Exercise patience,"
answered the Grand High Witch.
"First, I am explaining to you how my Formula 80 Delayed Action Mouse Maker is working. Listen carefully."
"We are listening," cried the audience, who were now jumping up and down in their chairs with excitement.
"Delayed Action Mouse Maker is a green liquid,"
explained the Grand High Witch,
"and 1 droplet in each chalk or sweet will be quite enough. So here is what happens. Child eats chalk which has in it Delayed Action Mouse Maker liquid. Child goes home feeling fine. Child goes to bed still feeling fine. Child wakes in the morning still okay. Child goes to school still feeling fine. Formula, you understand, is delayed action and is not working yet."
"We understand, O brainy one," cried the audience. "But when does it start working?"
"It is starting to work at exactly 9 o'clock. When the child is arriving at school,"
shouted the Grand High Witch triumphantly.
"Child arrives at school. Delayed Action Mouse Maker immediately starts to work. Child starts to shrink. Child is starting to grow fur. Child is starting to grow tail. All is happening in precisely 26 seconds. After 26 seconds, child is not a child any longer. It is a mouse."
"A mouse," cried the witches. "What a frumptuous thought!"
"Classrooms will all be swarming with mice,"
shouted the Grand High Witch.
"Chaos and pandemonium will be reigning in every school in England. Teachers will be hopping up and down. Women teachers will be standing on desks and holding up skirts and yelling, "Help! Help! Help!"
They will, cried the audience.
"And what,"
shouted the Grand High Witch,
"is happening next in every school?"
Tell us, they cried. Tell us, O brainy one. The Grand High Witch stretched her stringy neck forward and grinned at the audience, showing 2 rows of pointed teeth, slightly blue. She raised her voice louder than ever and shouted,
"Mousetraps is coming out!"
"Mousetraps," cried the witches.
"And cheese!"
shouted the Grand High Witch.
"Teachers is all rushing and running out and getting mousetraps and baiting them with cheese and putting them down all over school. Mice is nibbling cheese. Mousetraps is going off. All over school, mousetraps is going snappity-snap. And mouse heads is rolling across the floors like marbles. All over England, in every school in England, noise of snapping mouse traps will be heard."
At this point, the disgusting old Grand High Witch began to do a sort of witch's dance up and down the platform, stamping her feet and clapping her hands. The entire audience joined in the clapping and the foot stomping. They were making such a tremendous racket that I thought surely Mr. Stringer would hear it and come banging at the door. But he didn't. Then, above all the noise, I heard the voice of the Grand High Witch screaming out some sort of an awful, gloating song.
"Down with children, do them in, boil their bones and fry their skin, bish them, squish them, bash them, mash them, break them, shake them, slash them, smash them. Offer chalks with magic powder, say eat up, then say it louder. Cram them full of sticky eats, send them home still guzzling sweets. And in the morning, little fools, go marching off to separate schools. A girl feels sick and goes all pale. She yells, 'Hey, look, I've grown a tail.' A boy who's standing next to her screams, 'Help, I think I'm growing fur.' Another shouts, 'We look like freaks. There's whiskers growing on our cheeks.' A boy who was extremely tall cries out, 'What's wrong? I'm growing small.' 4 tiny legs begin to sprout from everybody round about, and all at once, all in a trice, there are no children, only mice. In every school is mice galore, all running round the schoolroom floor, and all the poor demented teachers is yelling, 'Hey, who are these creatures?' They stand upon the desks and shout, 'Get out, you filthy mice, get out! Will someone fetch some mouse traps, please? And don't forget to bring the cheese.' Now mouse traps come and every trap goes snippy snip and snappy snap. The mouse traps have a powerful spring. The springs go crack and snap and ping. Is lovely noise for us to hear, is music to a witch's ear. Dead mice is every place around, piled 2 feet deep upon the ground, with teachers searching left and right, but not a single child in sight. The teachers cry, 'What's going on? Oh, where have all the children gone?' It's 9:30, and as a rule, they're never late as this for school. Poor teachers don't know what to do. Some sit and read, and just a few amuse themselves throughout the day by sweeping all the mice away. And all us witches shout, 'Hooray!'"
The Landlady, 1959. Billy Weaver had traveled down from London on the slow afternoon train with a change at Swindon on the way, and by the time he got to Bath it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, and the moon was coming up out of a clear starry sky over the houses opposite the station entrance. But the air was deadly cold, and the wind was like a flat blade of ice on his cheeks. "Excuse me," he said, But is there a fairly cheap hotel not too far away from here?" "Try the Bell and Dragon," the porter answered, pointing down the road. "They might take you in. It's about 1/4 of a mile along the other side." Billy thanked him and picked up his suitcase and set out to walk the 1/4 mile to the Bell and Dragon. He had never been to Bath before. He didn't know anyone who lived there, but Mr. Greenslade at the head office in London had told him it was a splendid city. "Find your own lodgings," he had said, "and then go along and report to the branch manager as soon as you've got yourself settled." Billy was 17 years old. He was wearing a new navy blue overcoat, a new brown Trilby hat, and a new brown suit, and he was feeling fine. He walked briskly down the street. He was trying to do everything briskly these days. Briskness, he had decided, was the one common characteristic of all successful businessmen. The big shots up at head office were absolutely fantastically brisk all the time. They were amazing. There were no shops in the wide street that he was walking along, only a line of tall houses on each side, all of them identical. They had porches and pillars and 4 or 5 steps going up to the front doors, and it was obvious that once upon a time they had been very swanky residences. But now, even in the darkness, he could see that the paint was peeling from the woodwork on the doors and windows, and that the handsome white facades were cracked and blotchy from neglect. Suddenly, in a downstairs window that was brilliantly illuminated by a street lamp not 6 yards away, Billy caught sight of a printed notice propped up against the glass in one of the upper panes. It said "Bed and Breakfast." There was a vase of pussy willows, tall and beautiful, standing just underneath the notice. He stopped walking and moved a bit closer. Green curtains, some sort of velvety material, were hanging down on either side of the window. The pussy willows looked wonderful beside them. He went right up and peered through the glass into the room, and the first thing he saw was a bright fire burning in the hearth. On the carpet in front of the fire, a pretty little dachshund was curled up asleep with its nose tucked into its belly. The room itself, so far as he could see in the half-darkness, was filled with pleasant furniture. There was a baby grand piano and a big sofa and several plump armchairs, and in one corner he spotted a large parrot in a cage. Animals were usually a good sign in a place like this, Billy told himself, and all in all, it looked to him as though it might be a pretty decent house to stay in. Certainly it would be more comfortable than the Bell and Dragon. On the other hand, a pub would be more congenial than a boarding house. There would be beer and darts in the evening and lots of people to talk to, and it would probably be a good bit cheaper, too. He had stayed a couple of nights in a pub once before, and he had liked it. He had never stayed in any boarding houses, and, to be perfectly honest, he was a tiny bit frightened of them. The name itself conjured up images of watery cabbage, rapacious landladies, and a powerful smell of kippers in the living room. After dithering about like this in the cold for 2 or 3 minutes, Billy decided that he would walk on and take a look at the Bell and Dragon before making up his mind. He turned to go. And now a queer thing happened to him. He was in the act of stepping back and turning away from the window when all at once his eye was caught and held in the most peculiar manner by the small notice that was there. "Bed and breakfast," it said. "Bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast, bed and breakfast." Each word was like a large black eye staring at him through the glass, holding him, compelling him, forcing him to stay where he was and not to walk away from that house. And the next thing he knew, he was actually moving across from the window to the front door of the house, climbing the steps that led up to it, and reaching for the bell. He pressed the bell. Far away in a back room he heard it ringing, and then at once, it must have been at once because he hadn't even had time to take his finger from the bell button, the door swung open and a woman was standing there. Normally, you ring the bell and you have at least a half-minute's wait before the door opens. But this dame was like a jack-in-the-box. He pressed the bell, and out she popped. It made him jump. She was about 45 or 50 years old, and the moment she saw him, she gave him a warm, welcoming smile. "Please come in," she said pleasantly. She stepped aside, holding the door wide open, and Billy found himself automatically starting forward into the house. The compulsion, or more accurately, the desire to follow after her into that house, was extraordinarily strong. "I saw the notice in the window," he said, holding himself back.
Yes, I know.
"I was wondering about a room."
It's all ready for you, my dear,
she said. She had a round pink face and very gentle blue eyes. "I was on my way to the Bell and Dragon," Billy told her, "but the notice in your window just happened to catch my eye."
My dear boy, she said, why don't you come in out of the cold?
"How much do you charge?"
5 and 6 pence a night, including breakfast.
It was fantastically cheap. It was less than half of what he had been willing to pay.
If that is too much, she added, then perhaps I can reduce it just a tiny bit. Do you desire an egg for breakfast? Eggs are expensive at the moment. It would be 6 pence less without the egg.
5 and 6 pence is fine, he answered. "I should like very much to stay here."
I knew you would. Do come in.
She seemed terribly nice. She looked exactly like the mother of one's best school friend, welcoming one into the house to stay for the Christmas holidays. Billy took off his hat and stepped over the threshold.
Just hang it there, she said, and let me help you with your coat.
There were no other hats or coats in the hall. There were no umbrellas, no walking sticks, nothing.
We have it all to ourselves, she said, smiling at him over her shoulder as she led the way upstairs. You see, it isn't very often I have the pleasure of taking a visitor into my little nest.
The old girl is slightly dotty, Billy told himself. But at 5 and 6 pence a night, who gives a damn about that? I should have thought she'd be simply swamped with applicants, he said politely.
Oh, I am, my dear, I am. But the trouble is that I'm inclined to be just a teeny-weeny bit choosy and particular, if you see what I mean.
Ah, yes.
But I'm always ready. Everything is always ready, day and night in the house, just on the off chance that an acceptable young gentleman will come along. And it is such a pleasure, my dear, such a very great pleasure when now and again I open the door and I see someone standing there who is just exactly right.
She was halfway up the stairs, and she paused with one hand on the stair rail, turning her head and smiling down at him with pale lips.
Like you, she added,
and her blue eyes traveled slowly all the way down the length of Billy's body to his feet, and then up again. On the first floor landing, she said to him, This floor is mine. They climbed up a second flight.
And this one is all yours, she said. Here's your room. I do hope you'll like it.
She took him into a small but charming front bedroom, switching on the light as she went in.
The morning sun comes right in at the window, Mr. Perkins. It is Mr. Perkins, isn't it?
No, he said. It's Weaver.
Mr. Weaver. How nice. I put a water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a hot water bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets, don't you agree? And you may light the gas fire at any time if you feel chilly.
Thank you, Billy said. Thank you ever so much. He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed and that the bedclothes had been neatly turned back on one side, all ready for someone to get in.
I'm so glad you appeared, she said, looking earnestly into his face. I was beginning to get worried.
That's all right, Billy answered brightly. You mustn't worry about me. He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it.
And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came here?
I'm not a bit hungry, thank you, he said. I think I'll just go to bed as soon as possible because tomorrow I've got to get up rather early and report to the office.
Very well, then. I'll leave you now so that you can unpack. But before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to do that because it's the law of the land, and we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage in the proceedings, do we?" She gave him a little wave of the hand and went quickly out of the room and closed the door. Now, the fact that his landlady appeared to be slightly off her rocker didn't worry Billy in the least. After all, she was not only harmless, there was no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war or something like that, and had never gotten over it. So, a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little dachshund was still sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cozy. "I'm a lucky fellow," he thought, rubbing his hands. "This is a bit of all right." He found the guest book lying open on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above his on the page, and, as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was a Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was a Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. "That's funny," he thought suddenly. Christopher Mulholland. It rings a bell. Now, where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was he a boy at school? No. Was it one of his sister's numerous young men, perhaps, or a friend of his father's? No, it wasn't any of those. He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now that he came to think of it, he wasn't at all sure that the second name didn't have almost as much of a familiar ring about it as the first. Gregory Temple, he said aloud, searching his memory. Christopher Mulholland. "Oh, such charming boys," a voice behind him answered, and he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tea tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. "They sound somewhat familiar," he said. "They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I've heard those names before somewhere. Isn't that queer? Maybe it was in the newspapers. They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers or footballers or something like that?" "Famous?" she said, setting the tea tray down on the low table in front of the sofa. "Oh no, I don't think they were famous. But they were extraordinarily handsome, both of them. I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear, just exactly like you." Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. "Look here," he said, noticing the dates. "The last entry is over 2 years old." "Is it?" "Yes, indeed. And Christopher Mulholland's is nearly a year before that. More than 3 years ago." "Dear me," she said, shaking her head and having a dainty little sigh. "I would never have thought it. How time does fly away from us all, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins?" "It's Weaver," Billy said. Weaver. "Oh, of course it is," she cried, sitting down on the sofa. "How silly of me. I do apologize. In one ear and out the other, that's me, Mr. Weaver." "You know something," Billy said. "Something that's really quite extraordinary about all of this." "No, dear, I don't." "Well, you see both of these names, Mulholland and Temple. I not only seem to remember each of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or other, in some peculiar way, they both appear to be sort of connected together as well, as though they were both famous for the same sort of thing, if you see what I mean. Like Dempsey and Tunney, for example, or Churchill and Roosevelt." "How amusing," she said. But come over here now, dear, and sit down beside me on the sofa, and I'll give you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed.
You really shouldn't bother, Billy said. I didn't mean you to do anything like that. He stood by the piano, watching her as she fussed about with the cups and saucers. He noticed that she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. I'm almost positive it was in the newspapers I saw them, Billy said. I'll think of it in a second. I'm sure I will. There is nothing more tantalizing than a thing like this, which lingers just outside the borders of one's memory. He hated to give up. Now wait a minute, he said. Wait just a minute. Mulholland. Christopher Mulholland. Wasn't that the name of the Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour through the West Country, and then all of a sudden...
Milk, she said, and sugar.
Yes, please. And then, all of a sudden...
Eton schoolboy, she said. Oh, no, my dear, that can't possibly be right, because my Mr. Mulholland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Come over here now and sit next to me and warm yourself in front of this lovely fire. Come on, your tea's all ready for you.
She patted the empty place beside her on the sofa, and she sat there smiling at Billy and waiting for him to come over. He crossed the room slowly and sat down on the edge of the sofa. She placed his teacup on the table in front of him.
There we are, she said. How nice and cozy this is, isn't it?
Billy started sipping his tea. She did the same. For half a minute or so, neither of them spoke. But Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned toward him, and he could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. Now and again he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not the least unpleasant, and it reminded him, well, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts? New leather? Or was it the corridors of a hospital?
Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea, she said at length. Never in my life have I seen anyone drink as much tea as dear sweet Mr. Mulholland.
I suppose he left fairly recently, Billy said. He was still puzzling his head about the two names. He was positive now that he had seen them in the newspapers and the headlines.
Left, she said, arching her brows. But my dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple is also here. They're on the 3rd floor, both of them together.
Billy set down his cup slowly on the table and stared at his landlady. She smiled back at him, and then she put out one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee.
How old are you, my dear? She asked.
17.
17, she cried. Oh, it's a perfect age. Mr. Mulholland was also 17, but I think he was a trifle shorter than you are. In fact, I'm sure he was, and his teeth weren't quite so white. You have the most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Did you know that?
They're not as good as they look, Billy said. They've got simply masses of fillings in them at the back.
Mr. Temple, of course, was a little older, she said, ignoring his remark. He was actually 28, and yet I would never have guessed it if you hadn't told me. Never in my whole life. There wasn't a blemish on his body.
A what? Billy said.
His skin was just like a baby's.
There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea. Then he set it down again gently in its saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but she seemed to have lapsed into another of her silences. He sat there staring straight ahead of him into the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. That parrot, he said at last. You know something? It had me completely fooled when I first saw it through the window from the street. I could have sworn it was alive.
Ah, alas, no longer.
It's most terribly clever the way it's been done, he said. It doesn't look in the least bit dead. Who did it?
I did.
You did?
Of course,
She said.
and have you met my little Basil as well?
She nodded toward the dachshund curled up so comfortably in front of the fire. Billy looked at it, and suddenly he realized that the animal had all the time been just as silent and motionless as the parrot. He put out a hand and touched it gently on the side of its back. The back was hard and cold, and when he pushed the hair to one side with his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, grayish-black and dry and perfectly preserved. "Good gracious me," he said. "How absolutely fascinating." He turned away from the dog and stared with deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. It must be awfully difficult to do a thing like that.
Not in the least, she said. I stuff all my little pets myself when they pass away. Will you have another cup of tea?
"No, thank you," Billy said. The tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't much care for it.
You did sign the book, didn't you?
"Oh, yes."
That's good, because later on, if I happen to forget what you were called, then I can always come down here and look it up. I still do that almost every day with Mr. Mulholland and Mr.
"Temple," Billy said. "Gregory Temple. Excuse me asking, but haven't there been any other guests here except them in the last 2 or 3 years?" Inclining her head slightly to the left, she looked up at him out of the corners of her eyes and gave him another gentle little smile.
No, my dear,
she said.
Only you.
The Sound Machine, 1949. It was a warm summer evening, and Klausner walked quickly through the front gate and around the side of the house and into the garden at the back. He went on down the garden until he came to a wooden shed, and he unlocked the door, went inside, and closed the door behind him. The interior of the shed was an unpainted room. Against one wall, on the left, there was a long wooden workbench, and on it, among a littering of wires and batteries and small sharp tools, there stood a black box about 3 feet long, the shape of a child's coffin. Klausner moved across the room to the box. The top of the box was open, and he bent down and began to poke and peer inside it among a mass of different colored wires and silver tubes. He picked up a piece of paper that lay beside the box, studied it carefully, put it down, peered inside the box, and started running his fingers along the wires, tugging gently at them to test the connections, glancing back at the paper, then into the box, then at the paper again, checking each wire. He did this for perhaps an hour. Then he put a hand around to the front of the box where there were 3 dials, and he began to twiddle them, watching at the same time the movement of the mechanism inside the box. All the while he kept speaking softly to himself, nodding his head, smiling sometimes, his hands always moving, the fingers moving swiftly, deftly inside the box, his mouth twisting into curious shapes when a thing was delicate or difficult to do, saying,
Yes, yes, and now this one. Yes, yes, but is this right? Is it, where's my diagram? Ah, yes, of course. Yes, yes, that's right. And now, good, good. Yes, yes, yes.
His concentration was intense. His movements were quick. There was an air of urgency about the way he worked, of breathlessness, of strong suppressed excitement. Suddenly he heard footsteps on the gravel path outside, and he straightened and turned swiftly as the door opened and a tall man came in. It was only Scott, the doctor. "Well, well, well," the doctor said. "So this is where you hide yourself in the evenings." "Hello, Scott," Klausner said. "I happened to be passing," the doctor told him, "so I dropped in to see how you were. There was no one in the house, so I came on down here. How's that throat of yours been behaving?"
"It's all right. It's fine."
"Now I'm here, I might as well have a look at it."
"Please don't trouble. I'm quite cured. I'm fine."
The doctor began to feel the tension in the room. He looked at the black box on the bench. Then he looked at the man. "You've got your hat on," he said.
"Oh, have I?"
Klausner reached up, removed the hat, and put it on the bench. The doctor came up closer and bent down to look into the box. "What's this?" he said. "Making a radio?"
"No, just fooling around."
"It's got rather complicated-looking innards."
"Yes."
Klausner seemed tense and distracted. "What is it?" the doctor asked. "It's rather a frightening-looking thing, isn't it?"
"It's just an idea."
"Yes?"
"It has to do with sound, that's all."
"But good heavens, man! Don't you get enough of that sort of thing all day in your work?"
"I like sound."
"So it seems." The doctor went to the door, turned, and said, "Well, I won't disturb you. Glad your throat's not worrying you anymore." But he kept standing there looking at the box, intrigued by the remarkable complexity of its inside, curious to know what the strange patient of his was up to. "What's it really for?" he asked. "You've made me inquisitive." Klausner looked down at the box, then at the doctor, and he reached up and began gently to scratch the lobe of his right ear. There was a pause. The doctor stood by the door, waiting, smiling.
"All right, I'll tell you if you're interested."
There was another pause, and the doctor could see that Klausner was having trouble about how to begin. He was shifting from one foot to the other, tugging at the lobe of his ear, looking at his feet, and then at last, slowly, he said, "Well, it's like this. The theory is very simple, really. The human ear, you know that it can't hear everything. There are sounds that are so low-pitched or so high-pitched that it can't hear them." "Yes," the doctor said, "yes."
"Well, speaking very roughly, any note so high that it has more than 15,000 vibrations a second, we can't hear it. Dogs have better ears than us. You know, you can buy a whistle whose note is so high-pitched that you can't hear it at all. Oh, but a dog can hear it."
"Yes, I've seen one," the doctor said.
"Of course you have. And on the scale, higher than the note of that whistle, there is another note, a vibration if you like. But I prefer to think of it as a note. You can't hear that one either. And above that there is another, and another rising right up the scale forever and ever and ever, an endless succession of notes, an infinity of notes. There is a note, if only our ears could hear it, so high that it vibrates 1,000,000 times a second, and another 1,000,000 times as high as that, and on, higher and higher, as far as numbers go, which is infinity, eternity, beyond the stars."
Klausner was becoming more animated every moment. He was a frail man, nervous and twitchy, with always moving hands. His large head inclined towards his left shoulder, as though his neck were not quite strong enough to support it rigidly. His face was smooth and pale, almost white, and the pale green eyes that blinked and peered from behind a pair of steel spectacles were bewildered, unfocused, remote. He was a frail, nervous, twitchy little man, a moth of a man, dreamy and distracted, suddenly fluttering and animated. And now the doctor, looking at that strange pale face and those pale gray eyes, felt that somehow there was about this little person a quality of distance, of immense, immeasurable distance, as though the mind were far away from where the body was. The doctor waited for him to go on. Klausner sighed and clasped his hands tightly together.
"I believe," he said, speaking more slowly now, "that there is a whole world of sound above us all the time that we cannot hear. It is possible that up there in those high-pitched, inaudible regions, there is a new, exciting music being made. with subtle harmonies and fierce grinding discords. A music so powerful that it would drive us mad if only our ears were tuned to hear the sound of it. There may be anything. For all we know, there may...
Yes, the doctor said, but it's not very probable.
Why not? Why not?
Klausner pointed to a fly sitting on a small roll of copper wire on the workbench.
You see that fly? What sort of noise is that fly making now? None that one can hear. But for all we know, the creature may be whistling like mad on a very high note, or barking or croaking or singing a song. It's got a mouth, hasn't it? It's got a throat.
The doctor looked at the fly and he smiled. He was still standing by the door with his hands on the doorknob. Well, he said, so you're going to check up on that?
Some time ago, Klausner said, I made a simple instrument that proved to me the existence of many odd inaudible sounds. Often I have sat and watched the needle of my instrument recording the presence of sound vibrations in the air when I myself could hear nothing. And those are the sounds I want to listen to. I want to know where they come from and who or what is making them.
And that machine on the table there, the doctor said, is that going to allow you to hear these noises?
It may. Who knows? So far I've had no luck, but I've made some changes in it, and tonight I'm ready for another trial. This machine, he said, touching it with his hands, is designed to pick up sound vibrations that are too high-pitched for reception by the human ear, and to convert them to a scale of audible tones. I tune it in, almost like a radio.
How do you mean?
It isn't complicated. Say I wish to listen to the squeak of a bat. That's a fairly high-pitched sound, about 30,000 vibrations a second. The average human ear can't quite hear it. Now, if there was a bat flying around this room and I tuned in to 30,000 on my machine, I would hear the squeaking of that bat very clearly. I would even hear the correct note, F sharp, or B flat, or whatever it might be, but merely at a much lower pitch. Don't you understand?
The doctor looked at the long, black coffin box. And you're going to try it tonight?
Yes.
Well, I wish you luck. He glanced at his watch. My goodness, he said, I must fly. Goodbye, and thank you for telling me. I must call again sometime and find out what happened. The doctor went out and closed the door behind him. For a while longer, Klausner fussed about with the wires in the black box. Then he straightened up and in a soft, excited whisper said, Now, we'll try it again. We'll take it out into the garden this time, and then perhaps, the reception will be better. Lift it up now, carefully. Oh my God, it's heavy. He carried the box to the door, found that he couldn't open the door without putting it down, carried it back, put it on the bench, opened the door, and then carried it with some difficulty into the garden. He placed the box carefully on a small wooden table that stood on the lawn. He returned to the shed and fetched a pair of earphones. He plugged the wire connections from the earphones into the machine and put the earphones over his ears. The movements of his hands were quick and precise. He was excited and breathed loudly and quickly through his mouth. He kept on talking to himself with little words of comfort and encouragement, as though he were afraid that the machine might not work, and also afraid of what might happen if it did. He stood there in the garden beside the wooden table, so pale, small, and thin that he looked like an ancient, consumptive, bespectacled child. The sun had gone down. There was no wind, no sound at all. From where he stood, he could see over a low fence into the next garden, and there was a woman walking down the garden with a flower basket on her arm. He watched her for a while without thinking about her at all. Then he turned to the box on the table and pressed a switch on its front. He put his left hand on the volume control and his right hand on a knob that moved a needle across a large central dial, like the wavelength dial of a radio. The dial was marked with many numbers in a series of bands, starting at 15,000 and going on up to 1 million. And now he was bending forward over the machine. His head was cocked to one side in a tense, listening attitude. His right hand was beginning to turn the knob. The needle was traveling slowly across the dial, so slowly he could hardly see it move, and in the earphones he could hear a faint, spasmodic crackling. Behind this crackling sound he could hear a distant humming tone, which was the noise of the machine itself, but that was all. As he listened, he became conscious of a curious sensation, a feeling that his ears were stretching out away from his head, that each ear was connected to his head by a thin, stiff wire like a tentacle, and that the wires were lengthening, that the ears were going up and up towards a secret and forbidden territory, a dangerous ultrasonic region where ears had never been before and had no right to be. The little needle crept slowly across the dial, and suddenly he heard a shriek, a frightful, piercing shriek, and he jumped and dropped his hands, catching hold of the edge of the table. He stared around him as if expecting to see the person who had shrieked. There was no one in sight except the woman in the garden next door, and it was certainly not she. She was bending down, cutting yellow roses and putting them in her basket. Again it came, a throatless, inhuman shriek, sharp and short, very clear and cold. The note itself possessed a minor, metallic quality that he had never heard before. Klausner looked around him, searching instinctively for the source of the noise. The woman next door was the only living thing in sight. He saw her reach down, take a rose stem in the fingers of one hand, and snip the stem with a pair of scissors. Again he heard the scream. It came at the exact moment when the rose stem was cut. At this moment, the woman straightened up, put the scissors in the basket with the roses, and turned to walk away.
Mrs. Saunders, Klausner shouted, his voice shrill with excitement. Oh, Mrs. Saunders!
And looking round, the woman saw her neighbor standing on his lawn, a fantastic arm-waving little person with a pair of earphones on his head, calling to her in a voice so high and loud that she became alarmed.
Cut another one! Please, cut another one, quickly!
She stood still, staring at him. Why, Mr. Klausner? She said. What's the matter?
Please do as I ask, he said. Cut just one more rose.
Mrs. Saunders had always believed her neighbor to be a rather peculiar person. Now it seemed that he had gone completely crazy. She wondered whether she should run into the house and fetch her husband. No, she thought. No, he's harmless. I'll just humor him. Certainly, Mr. Klausner, if you like, she said. She took her scissors from the basket, bent down, and snipped another rose. Again, Klausner heard that frightful, throatless shriek in the earphones. Again, it came at the exact moment the rose stem was cut. He took off the earphones and ran to the fence that separated the two gardens.
All right, he said. That's enough. No more. Please, no more.
The woman stood there, a yellow rose in one hand, clippers in the other, looking at him.
I'm going to tell you something, Mrs. Saunders, he said. Something that you won't believe.
He put his hands on top of the fence and peered at her intently through his thick spectacles.
You have, this evening, cut a basketful of roses. You have, with a sharp pair of scissors, cut through the stems of living things, and each rose that you cut screamed in the most terrible way. Did you know that, Mrs. Saunders?
No, she said. I certainly didn't know that.
It happens to be true, he said.
He was breathing rather rapidly, but he was trying to control his excitement.
I heard them shrieking. Each time you cut one, I heard the cry of pain. A very high-pitched sound, approximately 132,000 vibrations a second. You couldn't possibly have heard it yourself, but I heard it.
Did you really, Mr. Klausner? She decided she would make a dash for the house in about 5 seconds.
You might say, he went on, that a rosebush has no nervous system to feel with, no throat to cry with. You'd be right, it hasn't. Not like ours, anyway. But how do you know, Mrs. Saunders?
And here he leaned far over the fence and spoke in a fierce whisper.
How do you know that a rosebush doesn't feel as much pain when someone cuts its stem in two as you would feel if someone cut your wrist off with a garden shears? How do you know that? It's alive, isn't it?
Yes, Mr. Klausner. Oh, yes, and good night. Quickly she turned and ran up the garden to her house. Klausner went back to the table. He put on the earphones and stood for a while listening. He could hear the faint crackling sound and the humming noise of the machine, but nothing more. He bent down and took hold of a small white daisy growing on the lawn. He took it between thumb and forefinger and slowly pulled it upward and sideways until the stem broke. From the moment that he started pulling to the moment when the stem broke, he distinctly heard in the earphones a faint, high-pitched cry, curiously inanimate. He took another daisy and did it again. Once more he heard the cry, but he wasn't sure now that it expressed pain. No, it wasn't pain. It was surprise. Or was it? It didn't really express any of the feelings or emotions known to a human being. It was just a cry, a neutral, stony cry, a single emotionless note expressing nothing. It had been the same with the roses. He had been wrong in calling it a cry of pain. A flower probably didn't feel pain. It felt something else which we didn't know about, something called tom or spun or plenukment or anything you like. He stood up and removed the earphones. It was getting dark and he could see pricks of light shining in the windows of the houses all around him. Carefully, he picked up the black box from the table, carried it into the shed, and put it on the workbench. Then he went out, locked the door behind him, and walked up to the house. The next morning, Klausner was up as soon as it was light. He dressed and went straight to the shed. He picked up the machine and carried it outside, clasping it to his chest with both hands, walking unsteadily under its weight. He went past the house, out through the front gate, and across the road to the park. There he paused and looked around him. Then he went on until he came to a large tree, a beech tree, and he placed the machine on the ground close to the trunk of the tree. Quickly he went back to the house and got an axe from the coal cellar and carried it across the road into the park. He put the axe on the ground beside the tree. Then he looked around him again, peering nervously through his thick glasses in every direction. There was no one about. It was 6 a.m. He put the earphones on his head and switched on the machine. He listened for a moment to the faint, familiar humming sound. Then he picked up the axe, took a stance with his legs wide apart, and swung the axe as hard as he could at the base of the tree trunk. The blade cut deep into the wood and stuck there, and at the instant of impact, he heard a most extraordinary noise in the earphones. It was a new noise, unlike any he had heard before, a harsh, noteless, enormous noise, a growling, low-pitched, screaming sound, not quick and short like the noise of the roses, but drawn out like a sob lasting for fully a minute, loudest at the moment when the axe struck, fading gradually fainter and fainter until it was gone. Klausner stared at horror at the place where the blade of the axe had sunk into the wood flesh of the tree. Then, gently, he took the axe handle, worked the blade loose, and threw the thing to the ground. With his fingers, he touched the gash that the axe had made in the wood, touching the edges of the gash, trying to press them together to close the wound, and he kept saying, "Tree! Oh, tree! I am sorry! I am sorry! But it will heal! It will heal fine!" For a while he stood there with his hands upon the trunk of the great tree. Then suddenly he turned away and hurried off out of the park, across the road, through the front gate and back into his house. He went to the telephone, consulted the book, dialed a number, and waited. He held the receiver tightly in his left hand and tapped the table impatiently with his right. He heard the telephone buzzing at the other end, and then the click of a lifted receiver and a man's voice, a sleepy voice saying, "Hello? Yes?"
"Dr. Scott?" he said.
"Yes, speaking."
"Dr. Scott, you must come at once. Quickly, please."
"Who is it speaking?"
"Klausner here. And you remember what I told you last night about my experience with sound and how I hoped I might—"
Yes, of course. But what's the matter? Are you ill?"
"No, I'm not ill, but—"
"It's 6:30 in the morning," the doctor said, "and you call me, but you are not ill."
"Please come. Come quickly. I want someone to hear it. It's driving me mad. I can't believe it."
The doctor heard the frantic, almost hysterical note in the man's voice, the same note he was used to hearing in the voices of people who called up and said, "There's been an accident, come quickly." He said, slowly, "You really want me to get out of bed and come over now?"
"Yes, now. At once, please."
"All right, then. I'll come." Klausner sat down beside the telephone and waited. He tried to remember what the shriek of the tree had sounded like, but he couldn't. He could remember only that it had been enormous and frightful, and that it had made him feel sick with horror. He tried to imagine what sort of a noise a human would make if he had to stand anchored to the ground while someone deliberately swung a small sharp thing at his leg so that the blade cut in deep and wedged itself in the cut. Same sort of noise, perhaps. No, but quite different. The noise of the tree was worse than any known human noise because of that frightening, toneless, throatless quality. He began to wonder about other living things, and he thought immediately of a field of wheat standing up straight and yellow and alive, with the mower going through it, cutting the stems, 500 stems a second, every second. Oh my God! What would that noise be like? 500 wheat plants screaming together, and every second another 500 being cut and screaming, and no, he thought, I do not want to go to a wheat field with my machine. I would never eat bread after that. But what about potatoes and cabbages and carrots and onions? And what about apples? Ah, no, apples are all right. They fall off naturally when they are ripe. Apples are all right if you let them fall off instead of tearing them from the tree branch. But not vegetables. Not a potato, for example. A potato would surely shriek. So would a carrot and an onion and a cabbage. He heard the click of the front gate latch, and he jumped up and went out and saw the tall doctor coming down the path, little black bag in his hand. "Well," the doctor said. "Well, what's all the trouble?"
"Come with me, doctor. I want you to hear it. I called you because you're the only one I've told. It's over the road in the park. Will you come now?"
The doctor looked at him. He seemed calmer now. There was no sign of madness or hysteria. He was merely disturbed and excited. They went across the road into the park, and Klausner led the way to the great beech tree at the foot of which stood the long black coffin box of the machine and the axe. "Well, why did you bring it out here?" the doctor asked.
I wanted a tree. There aren't any big trees in the garden.
"And why the axe?"
You'll see in a moment. But now, please put on these earphones and listen. Listen carefully and tell me afterwards precisely what you hear. I want to make quite sure.
The doctor smiled and took the earphones and put them over his ears. Klausner bent down and flicked the switch on the panel of the machine. Then he picked up the axe and took his stance with his legs apart, ready to swing. For a moment he paused.
Can you hear anything? He said to the doctor.
Can I what?
Can you hear anything?
Just a humming noise. Klausner stood there with the axe in his hands, trying to bring himself to swing, but the thought of the noise that the tree would make made him pause again. "Well, what are you waiting for?" the doctor asked.
Nothing,
Klausner answered, and then lifted the axe and swung it at the tree, and as he swung he thought he felt. He could swear he felt a movement of the ground on which he stood. He felt a slight shifting of the earth beneath his feet, as though the roots of the tree were moving underneath the soil, but it was too late to check the blow, and the axe blade struck the tree and wedged deep into the wood. At that moment, high overhead, there was the cracking sound of wood splintering and the swishing sound of leaves brushing against other leaves, and they both looked up, and the doctor cried, "Watch out! Run, man! Quickly, run!" The doctor had ripped off the earphones and was running away fast, but Klausner stood spellbound, staring up at the great branch, 60 feet long at least, that was bending slowly downward, breaking and crackling and splintering at its thickest point, where it joined the main trunk of the tree. The branch came crashing down, and Klausner leapt aside just in time. It fell upon the machine and smashed it into pieces. "Great heavens!" shouted the doctor as he came running back. "That was a near one! I thought it had got you!" Klausner was staring at the tree. His large head was leaning to one side, and upon his smooth white face there was a tense, horrified expression. Slowly he walked up to the tree, and gently he prized the blade loose from the trunk.
"Did you hear it?"
he said, turning to the doctor. His voice was barely audible. The doctor was still out of breath from running and the excitement. "Hear what?"
"In the earphones. Did you hear anything when the axe struck?"
The doctor began to rub the back of his neck. "Well," he said, "as a matter of fact—" He paused and frowned and bit his lower lip. "No, I'm not sure. I couldn't be sure. I don't suppose I had the earphones on for more than a second after the axe struck."
Yes, but what did you hear?"
"I don't know what I heard. Probably the noise of the branch breaking." He was speaking rapidly, rather irritably.
"What did it sound like?"
Klausner leaned forward slightly, staring hard at the doctor.
"Exactly what did it sound like?"
"Oh, hell," the doctor said. "I really don't know. I was more interested in getting out of the way. Let's leave it."
"Dr. Scott, what did it sound like?"
"For God's sake, how could I tell? What with half the tree falling on me and having to run for my life?" The doctor certainly seemed nervous. Klausner had sensed it now. He stood quite still, staring at the doctor, and for fully half a minute he didn't speak. The doctor moved his feet, shrugged his shoulders, and half turned to go. "Well," he said, "we'd better get back." "Look," said the little man, and now his smooth white face became suddenly suffused with color. "Look," he said,
"you stitch this up."
He pointed to the last gash that the axe had made in the tree trunk.
"You stitch this up, quickly."
"Don't be silly," the doctor said.
"You do as I say. Stitch it up."
Klausner was gripping the axe handle, and he spoke softly, in a curious, almost a threatening tone. "Don't be silly," the doctor said. "I can't stitch through wood. Come on, let's get back."
So you can't stitch through wood?
"No, of course not."
Have you got any iodine in your bag?
"What if I have?"
Then paint the cut with iodine. It'll sting, but that can't be helped.
"Now look," the doctor said, and again he turned as if to go. "Let's not be ridiculous. Let's get back to the house and then—"
Paint the cut with iodine.
The doctor hesitated. He saw Klausner's hands tightening on the handle of the axe. He decided that his only alternative was to run away, fast, and he certainly wasn't going to do that. "All right," he said. "I'll paint it with iodine." He got his black bag, which was lying on the grass about 10 yards away, opened it, and took out a bottle of iodine and some cotton wool. He went up to the tree trunk, uncorked the bottle, tipped some of the iodine onto the cotton wool, bent down, and began to dab it into the cut. He kept one eye on Klausner, who was standing motionless with the axe in his hand, watching him.
Make sure you get it right in.
"Yes," the doctor said.
Now, do the other one, the one just above it.
The doctor did as he was told. "There you are," he said. "It's done." He straightened up and surveyed his work in a very serious manner. "That should do nicely." Klausner came closer and gravely examined the 2 wounds.
Yes,
he said, nodding his huge head slowly up and down.
Yes, that will do nicely.
He stepped back a pace.
You'll come and look at them again tomorrow.
"Oh, yes," the doctor said. "Of course."
And put some more iodine on.
"If necessary, yes."
Thank you, Doctor, Klausner said,
and he nodded his head again, and he dropped the axe, and all at once he smiled, a wild, excited smile. And quickly the doctor went over to him and gently took him by the arm, and he said, "Come on, we must go now." And suddenly they were walking away, the 2 of them, walking silently, rather hurriedly across the park, over the road, back to the house. Man from the South, 1948. It was getting on towards 6 o'clock, so I thought I'd buy myself a beer and go out and sit in a deck chair by the swimming pool and have a little evening sun. I went to the bar and got the beer and carried it outside and wandered down the garden toward the pool. It was a fine garden, with lawns and beds of azaleas and tall coconut palms, and the wind was blowing strongly through the tops of the palm trees, making the leaves hiss and crackle as though they were on fire. I could see the clusters of big brown nuts hanging down underneath the leaves. There were plenty of deck chairs around the swimming pool, and there were white tables and huge brightly colored umbrellas and sunburned men and women sitting around in bathing suits. In the pool itself there were 3 or 4 girls and about a dozen boys, all splashing about and making a lot of noise and throwing a large rubber ball at one another. I stood watching them. The girls were English girls from the hotel. The boys I didn't know about, but they sounded American, and I thought they were probably naval cadets who'd come ashore from the U.S. naval training vessel, which had arrived in harbor that morning. I went over and sat down under a yellow umbrella where there were 4 empty seats, and I poured my beer and settled back comfortably with a cigarette. It was very pleasant sitting there in the sunshine with beer and cigarette. It was pleasant to sit and watch the bathers splashing about in the green water. The American soldiers were getting on very nicely with the English girls. They'd reached the stage where they were diving under the water and tipping them up by their legs. Just then, I noticed a small, oldish man walking briskly around the edge of the pool. He was immaculately dressed in a white suit, and he walked very quickly with little bouncing strides, pushing himself high up onto his toes with each step. He had on a large, creamy Panama hat, and he came bouncing along the side of the pool, looking at the people and the chairs. He stopped beside me and smiled, showing 2 rows of very small, uneven teeth, slightly tarnished. I smiled back.
"Excuse, please, but may I sit here?"
He bobbed around to the back of the chair and inspected it for safety. Then he sat down and crossed his legs. His white buckskin shoes had little holes punched all over them for ventilation.
"A fine evening,"
he said.
"They are all evenings fine here in Jamaica."
I couldn't tell if the accent was Italian or Spanish, but I felt fairly sure he was some sort of a South American. And old, too, when you saw him close. Probably around 68 or 70. "Yes," I said, "it is wonderful here, isn't it?"
"And who, may I ask, are all these? These is no hotel people."
He was pointing at the bathers in the pool. "I think they're American sailors," I told him. "They're Americans who are learning to be sailors."
"Oh, of course they are Americans. Who else in the world is going to make as much noise as that? You are not American, no?"
"No," I said, "I am not." Suddenly, one of the American cadets was standing in front of us. He was dripping wet from the pool, and one of the English girls was standing there with him. "Are these chairs taken?" he said. "No," I answered. "Mind if I sit down?" "Go ahead." "Thanks," he said. He had a towel in his hand, and when he sat down he unrolled it and produced a pack of cigarettes and a lighter. He offered the cigarettes to the girl, and she refused. Then he offered them to me, and I took one. The little man said,
"Thank you, no, but I think I have a cigar."
He pulled out a crocodile case and got himself a cigar. Then he produced a knife which had a small scissors in it, and he snipped the end off the cigar. "Here, let me give you a light." The American boy held up his lighter.
"That will not work in this wind."
"Sure it'll work. It always works." The little man removed his unlighted cigar from his mouth, cocked his head on one side, and looked at the boy.
"Always?"
he said slowly. "Sure, it never fails. Not with me, anyway." The little man's head was still cocked over on one side, and he was still watching the boy.
Well, so you say this famous lighter, it never fails. Is that what you say?"
"Sure," the boy said. "That's right." He was about 19 or 20, with a long, freckled face and a rather sharp, bird-like nose. His chest was not very sunburned, and there were freckles there, too, and a few wisps of pale reddish hair. He was holding the lighter in his right hand, ready to flip the wheel. "It never fails," he said, smiling now because he was purposefully exaggerating his little boast. "I promise you it never fails."
"One moment, please."
The hand that held the cigar came up high, palm outward, as though it were stopping traffic.
"Now, just one moment."
He had a curiously soft, toneless voice, and he kept looking at the boy all the time.
"Shall we not perhaps make a little bet on that?"
He smiled at the boy.
"Shall we not make a little bet on whether your lighter lights?"
"Sure, I'll bet," the boy said. "Why not?"
"You like to bet?"
"Sure, I'll always bet." The man paused and examined his cigar, and I must say I didn't much like the way he was behaving. It seemed he was already trying to make something out of this, and to embarrass the boy, and at the same time I had the feeling he was relishing a private little secret all his own. He looked up again at the boy and said slowly,
"I like to bet, too. Why don't we have a good bet on this thing? A good, big bet."
"Now wait a minute," the boy said. "I can't do that. But I'll bet you a quarter. I'll even bet you $1, or whatever it is over here. Some shillings, I guess." The little man waved his hand again.
Listen to me. Now we have some fun. We make a bet. Then we go up to my room here in the hotel, where is no wind. And I bet you cannot light this famous lighter of yours 10 times running without missing once.
I'll bet I can, the boy said.
All right, good. We make a bet, yes?
Sure, I'll bet you $1.
No. I make you a very good bet. I am a rich man, and I am a sporting man also. Listen to me. Outside the hotel is my car. Is very fine car. American car from your country. Cadillac.
Hey now, wait a minute. The boy leaned back in his deck chair and he laughed. I can't put up that sort of property. That's crazy.
Not crazy. Not crazy at all. You strike lighter successfully 10 times running, and Cadillac is yours. You like to have this Cadillac, yes?
Sure, I'd like to have a Cadillac. The boy was still grinning.
All right, fine. We make a bet, and I put up my Cadillac.
And what do I put up? The little man carefully removed the red band from his still unlighted cigar.
I never ask you, my friend, to bet something you cannot afford. You understand.
Then what do I bet?
I make it very easy for you, yes?
Okay, you make it easy.
Some small thing you can afford to give away, and if you did happen to lose it, you would not feel too bad, right?
Such as what?
Such as, perhaps, the little finger on your left hand.
My what? The boy stopped grinning.
Yes, why not? You win, you take the car. You boss, I take the finger.
I don't get it. How do you mean you take the finger?
I chop it off.
Jumping jeepers, that's a crazy bet. I think I'll just make it $1. The little man leaned back, spread out his hands, palms upward, and gave a tiny, contemptuous shrug of the shoulders.
I do not understand. You say it lights, but you will not bet. Then we forget it, yes.
The boy sat quite still, staring at the bathers in the pool. Then he remembered suddenly he hadn't lighted his cigarette. He put it between his lips, cupped his hand around the lighter, and flipped the wheel. The wick lighted and burned with a small, steady yellow flame, and the way he held his hands, the wind didn't get to it at all. "Could I have a light, too?" I said. "Oh, God, I'm sorry, I forgot you didn't have one." I held out my hand for the lighter, but he stood up and came over to do it for me. "Thank you," I said, and he returned to his seat. "You having a good time?" I asked. "Fine," he answered. "It's pretty nice here." There was a silence then, and I could see that the little man had succeeded in disturbing the boy with his absurd proposal. He was sitting there very still, and it was obvious that a small tension was beginning to build up inside him. Then he started shifting about in his seat and rubbing his chest and stroking the back of his neck, and finally he placed both hands on his knees and began tapping with his fingers against the kneecaps. Soon he was tapping with one of his feet as well. "Now let me just check up on this bet of yours," he said at last. "You say we go up to your room, and if I make this lighter light 10 times running, I win a Cadillac. If it misses just once, though, then I forfeit the little finger on my left hand. Is that right?"
Certainly, and that is the bet, but I think you are afraid.
What do we do if I lose? Do I have to hold my finger out while you chop it off?
Oh no, that would be no good. And you might be tempted to refuse to hold it out. What I should do, I should tie one of your hands to the table before we started, and I should stand there with a knife ready to go chop the moment your lighter missed.
What year is the Cadillac? The boy asked.
Excuse, I not understand.
What year? How old is the Cadillac?
How old? Yes, it is last year. Quite a new car. But I see you are not a betting man. Americans never are.
The boy paused for just a moment, and he glanced first at the English girl, then at me. Yes, he said sharply. I'll bet you.
Good.
The little man clapped his hands together quietly, once.
Fine, he said. We do it now. And you, sir, he turned to me. You would perhaps be good enough to, what you call it, to referee.
He had pale, almost colorless eyes with tiny, bright black pupils. Well, I said, I think it's a crazy bet. I don't think I like it very much. Nor do I, said the English girl. It was the first time she'd spoken. I think it's a stupid, ridiculous bet. Are you serious about cutting off the boy's finger if he loses? I said.
Certainly I am. Also about giving him Cadillac if he win. Come now, we go to my room.
He stood up.
You like to put on some clothes first, he said.
No, the boy answered. I'll come like this. Then he turned to me. I'd consider it a favor if you'd come along and referee. All right, I said. I'll come along, but I don't like the bet. You come too, he said to the girl. You come and watch. The little man led the way back through the garden to the hotel. He was animated now and excited, and that seemed to make him bounce up higher than ever on his toes as he walked along.
I live in Annex, he said. You like to see car first. It is just here.
He took us to where we could see the front driveway of the hotel, and he stopped and pointed to a sleek, pale green Cadillac parked close by.
There she is. It's a green one. You like?
Say, that's a nice car, the boy said.
All right, now we go up and see if you can win her.
We followed him into the annex and up one flight of stairs. He unlocked his door, and we all trooped into what was a large, pleasant double bedroom. There was a woman's dressing gown lying across the bottom of one of the beds.
First,
he said,
we have a little martini.
The drinks were on a small table in the far corner, all ready to be mixed, and there was a shaker and ice and plenty of glasses. He began to make the martini, but meanwhile he'd rung the bell, and now there was a knock on the door and a maid came in. Ah, he said, putting down the bottle of gin, taking a wallet from his pocket and pulling out a £1 note.
You will do something for me, please.
He gave the maid the £1.
You keep that, he said. And now we are going to play a little game in here. And I want you to go off and find for me 3 things. I want some nails, I want a hammer, and I want a chopping knife. A butcher's chopping knife, which you can borrow from the kitchen. You can get that, yes?
A chopping knife? The maid opened her eyes wide and clasped her hands in front of her. You mean a real chopping knife?
Yes, of course. Come on now, please. You can find those things surely for me.
Yes, sir. I'll try, sir. Surely I'll try to get them. And she went. The little man handed round the martinis. We stood there and sipped them. The boy with the long freckled face and the pointed nose, bare-bodied except for a pair of faded brown bathing shorts. The English girl, a large-boned, fair-haired girl wearing a pale blue bathing suit, who watched the boy over the top of her glasses all the time. The little man with the colorless eyes standing there in his immaculate white suit, drinking his martini and looking at the girl in her pale blue bathing dress. I didn't know what to make of it all. The man seemed serious about the bet, and he seemed serious about the business of cutting off the finger. But hell, what if the boy lost? Then we'd have to rush him to the hospital in the Cadillac that he hadn't won. Now wouldn't that really be a fine thing? It would be a damn silly, unnecessary thing so far as I could see. Don't you think this is rather a silly bet? I said. I think it's a fine bet, the boy answered. He had already downed one large martini. I think it's a stupid, ridiculous bet, the girl said. What'll happen if you lose? It won't matter. Come to think of it, I can't remember ever in my life having had any use for the little finger on my left hand. Here he is. The boy took hold of the finger, and he hasn't ever done a thing for me yet. So why shouldn't I bet him? I think it's a fine bet. The little man smiled and picked up the shaker and refilled our glasses. Before we begin, he said, I will present to the referee the key of the car. He produced a car key from his pocket and gave it to me. The papers, he said, the owning papers and insurance are in the pocket of the car. Then the maid came in again. In one hand she carried a small chopper, the kind used by butchers for chopping meat bones, and in the other a hammer and a bag of nails. Good, you got them all. Thank you. Now you can go. He waited until the maid had closed the door. Then he put the implements on one of the beds and said, Now we prepare ourselves, yes? And to the boy, Help me, please, with this table. We carry it out a little. It was the usual kind of hotel writing desk, just a plain rectangular table about 4 feet by 3 with a blotting pad, ink, pens, and paper. They carried it out into the room away from the wall and removed the writing things. And now, he said, a chair. He picked up a chair and placed it beside the table. He was very brisk and very animated, like a person organizing games at a children's party. And now, the nails. I must put in the nails. He fetched the nails, and he began to hammer them into the top of the table. We stood there, the boy, the girl, and I, holding martinis in our hands, watching the little man at work. We watched him hammer 2 nails into the table about 6 inches apart. He didn't hammer them right home. He allowed a small part of each one to stick up. Then he tested them for firmness with his fingers. Anyone would think the son of a bitch had done this before, I told myself. He never hesitates. Table, nails, hammer, kitchen chopper. He knows exactly what he needs and how to arrange it. And now, he said, all we want is some string. He found some string. All right, at last, we are ready. Will you please to sit here at the table? He said to the boy. The boy put his glass away and sat down. Now, place the left hand between these 2 nails. The nails are only so I can tie your hand in place. All right, good. Now I tie your hand secure to the table. So. He wound the string around the boy's wrist. Then several times around the wide part of the hand. Then he fastened it tight to the nails. He made a good job of it, and when he'd finished, there wasn't any question about the boy being able to draw his hand away. But he could move his fingers. Now please, clench the fist, all except for the little finger. You must leave the little finger sticking out, lying on the table. Excellent, excellent. Now we are ready. With your right hand,
You manipulate the lighter. But one moment, please.
He skipped over to the bed and picked up the chopper. He came back and stood beside the table with the chopper in his hand.
We are all ready, he said. Mr. Referee, you must say to begin.
The English girl was just standing there in her pale blue bathing costume right behind the boy's chair. She was just standing there, not saying anything. The boy was sitting quite still, holding the lighter in his right hand, looking at the chopper. The little man was looking at me. "Are you ready?" I asked the boy. "I'm ready." "And you?" to the little man.
Quite ready,
he said, and he lifted the chopper up in the air and held it there about 2 feet above the boy's finger, ready to chop. The boy watched it, but didn't flinch, and his mouth didn't move at all. He merely raised his eyebrows and frowned. "All right," I said. "Go ahead." The boy said, "Will you please count aloud the number of times I light it?" "Yes," I said, "I'll do that." With his thumb, he raised the top of the lighter, and again with the thumb he gave the wheel a sharp flick. The flint sparked and the wick caught fire and burned with a small yellow flame. "One," I called. He didn't blow the flame out. He closed the top of the lighter on it, and he waited for perhaps 5 seconds before opening it again. He flicked the wheel very strongly, and once more there was a small flame burning on the wick. 2. No one else said anything. The boy kept his eyes on the lighter. The little man held the chopper up in the air, and he, too, was watching the lighter. 3. 4. 5. 6. 7. Obviously, it was one of those lighters that worked. The flint gave a big spark, and the wick was the right length. I watched the thumb snapping the top down onto the flame. Then a pause. Then the thumb raising the top once more. This was an all-thumb operation. The thumb did everything. I took a breath, ready to say 8. The thumb flicked the wheel. The flint sparked. The little flame appeared. 8, I said. And as I said it, the door opened. We all turned, and we saw a woman standing in the doorway, a small black-haired woman, rather old, who stood there for about 2 seconds, then rushed forward, shouting, "Carlos! Carlos!" She grabbed his wrist, took the chopper from him, threw it on the bed, took hold of the little man by the lapels of his white suit, and began shaking him very vigorously, talking to him fast and loud and fiercely all the time in some Spanish-sounding language. She shook him so fast you couldn't see him anymore. He became a faint, misty, quickly moving outline, like the spokes of a turning wheel. Then she slowed down, and the little man came into view again, and she hauled him across the room and pushed him backwards onto one of the beds. He sat on the edge of it, blinking his eyes and testing his head to see if it would still turn on his neck. "I am sorry," the woman said. "I am so terribly sorry that this should happen." She spoke almost perfect English. "It is too bad," she went on. "I suppose it is really my fault. For 10 minutes I leave him alone to go and have my hair washed, and I come back and he is at it again." She looked sorry and deeply concerned. The boy was untying his hand from the table. The English girl and I stood there and said nothing. "He is a menace," the woman said. "Down where we live at home, he has taken altogether 47 fingers from different people, and he has lost 11 cars. In the end, they threatened to have him put away somewhere. That's why I brought him up here." "We were only having a little bet," mumbled the little man from the bed. "I suppose he bet you a car?" the woman said. "Yes," the boy answered, "a Cadillac." "He has no car. It's mine, and that makes it worse," she said. "That he should bet you when he has nothing to bet with."
I am ashamed and very sorry about it all."
She seemed an awfully nice woman. "Well," I said, "then here's the key of your car." I put it on the table.
"We were only having a little bet,"
Mumbled the little man.
"He hasn't anything left to bet with," the woman said. "He hasn't a thing in the world. Not a thing. As a matter of fact, I myself won it all from him a long time ago. It took time, a lot of time, and it was hard work, but I won it all from him in the end."
She looked up at the boy and she smiled, a slow, sad smile, and she came over and put out a hand to take the key from the table. I can still see it now, that hand of hers. It had only one finger on it.
Oh, I met that man from the south. Oh, I met that man from the south. Had a big cigar in his mouth, so I knew he's from the south.